Get out of here, old man. You don't belong here. Get out of here. I don't want to see you again.
Have you ever witnessed a moment so quiet, it made noise? Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that descends like a warning. A stillness so sudden, so complete, you can hear your own heartbeat over the buzz of everything around it. That was the moment. Right there in the middle of a sleepy Saturday farmer's market in Knoxville. The peaches were ripe. The bread was warm. The banjo player strumming, "Take Me Home, Country Roads," was off-key but endearing. It was one of those small-town mornings where everything moved slow enough to feel safe. Families wandered between stalls like the world was made of tomato baskets and second chances. Kids chased bubbles in the sunshine. Lovers lingered too long at the pickle stand, and the scent of basil mixed with lavender in the warm breeze. The kind of day that felt like a living postcard. And then came the man. He didn't arrive with fanfare. No one saw him pull up. No one saw from which direction he came. He just appeared. His skin was dark, the kind of dark that turns bronze in the sun, and his frame was draped in an old military jacket that hadn't been new in 2 decades. The brass buttons were scratched. The fabric worn soft from time, not fashion. A canvas satchel hung from his shoulder, sturdy, stained, and unmistakably military. At first, nobody paid much attention. After all, it was a public space, and this was America. People came and went. But after a few minutes, you could feel it shift. The conversations dulled. The smiles thinned. A mother pulled her child closer, not out of malice. Just that quiet, inherited suspicion that lives in places where history was never properly buried. He didn't speak. Didn't approach anyone. Just stood there, close to a booth that sold wildflower honey and squash so green it looked photoshopped. His eyes scanned the market, not suspiciously, not aggressively, but with a heaviness that made people uncomfortable. A heaviness that said he'd seen things. Ronnie, the pickle vendor who greeted everyone with a rehearsed joke, didn't greet him. Marla, who ran the soap stall and always smiled at strangers, suddenly found her phone very interesting. It wasn't overt. No one said anything. But presence has weight and is carried something the market wasn't ready to hold. He adjusted the strap of his satchel. Slowly. Deliberately. Like he knew eyes were on him. Like he'd felt this before. And then the girl fell. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, all elbows and energy, running too fast for her mother's reach. Her foot caught on a chair leg. She went down hard, palms scraping against pavement. Her scream, sharp, brief, cut through the market chatter like a siren. Before her mother could move, the man was there. He crouched beside her, careful not to startle. He didn't touch her. Just asked if she was okay in a voice so low and smooth it seemed to hush the entire street. He offered her a tissue from his pocket and then, with a quiet flourish, a peppermint wrapped in red and white cellophane. She took it. The mother arrived a beat later, breathless. Her eyes flicked from her daughter to the man to the candy. Something flashed across her face, relief, then tension. She scooped the girl up and stepped back. "Say thank you," she murmured without looking at him. The little girl did. The man nodded once and stood, silent again. The moment passed, but not for Travis. Travis worked the stall down near the corner, the one with jam jars stacked in perfect pyramids. He was the kind of man who wore his high school football ring like it still mattered, and his politics on his shirt. He'd been watching the whole thing, arms crossed, expression curdling. And now he'd had enough. "You lost, buddy?" he called, loud and lazy, the kind of voice that carried and invited attention. "This ain't the jungle." A collective breath caught. People turned. Eyes widened. No one laughed. The banjo stopped. The veteran didn't move. "I said," Travis repeated, stepping around his table, "maybe you'd be more comfortable back where you came from. Don't need you staring people down like some." He didn't finish. Because at that moment, the man moved. Not toward Travis. Not with anger. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply knelt, slowly, and placed his satchel on the ground. And then he unzipped it. The crowd froze. One man near the lemonade stand pulled his wife behind him. A teenage boy dropped his phone. A vendor took a step back. Because this was the moment, the kind of moment people fear in places they think are too safe for conflict. The kind of moment they read about after the fact. But the veteran wasn't reaching for violence. He was reaching for something else. And in that bag, under a folded flag, next to an old photograph of 3 men in desert camo and dirt-smudged smiles, was something that would split the market, not with fear, not with chaos, but with truth. The kind of truth that leaves a scar. And just like that, a simple Saturday morning was no longer just a morning. It was a reckoning. He hadn't always been a ghost. Once, long before the stares and long silences, before the ache in his knees and the fold in his flag, the man in the army jacket had a name people said with pride. Not a whisper, not a caution, but a name spoken like a promise. Sergeant Elijah Rawlins. Born and raised in a part of Georgia where the soil was red, the front porches wide, and the rules unwritten but strictly enforced, Elijah had learned early that respect wasn't given, it was earned. He was the kind of child who stood when elders entered the room, the kind of boy who looked people in the eyes, even when it was dangerous. Especially then. He enlisted at 17. Not because he loved the idea of war. No, Elijah loved peace too much for that. But because it was the only road out of a town that never expected him to leave. A recruiter had shaken his hand and called him, "Sir." And just like that, the world opened wider than the cotton fields and church pews he'd known. Or taught him how to survive. But it was his humanity that taught him how to live. In the desert sun of Kandahar, he learned the sound of real silence, the kind that came after the blast. He learned that courage wasn't about pulling the trigger, it was about dragging a man twice your weight out of the kill zone, even when your leg was bleeding and your ears were ringing like hell's bells. He came back different. Not broken. Just realigned. The world looked different when you'd seen it burn. The petty things people complained about, traffic, coffee orders, lost Wi-Fi, they became background noise. He didn't judge them. But he couldn't join them either. Back home, Elijah wore his uniform with pride. Not for the medals. He kept those in a box under his bed. It was the fabric he respected. The code it stood for. The brotherhood. The sacrifice. But America, for all its parades and slogans, has a strange way of turning its back on the very men it sends into fire. The first time it happened was at a diner. He had walked in on a cold January morning, his breath still clouding in the air, the bell above the door jingling politely. He sat down at the counter and waited. And waited. And waited. The waitress moved past him 3 times before she finally made eye contact. Her smile was tight. Polite. Force. And when he ordered coffee and eggs, she nodded like she hadn't heard and walked off. 20 minutes later, nothing had arrived. But the table behind him, 3 men, white, loud, full of jokes about the good old days. They'd been served before he even sat down. Elijah left without a word. That was his way. Never the loud one. Never the one who fought fire with fire. He had seen real fire. He knew where that led. Still, it chipped away at something inside him. Not his pride. Elijah's pride wasn't built on the approval of strangers, but his hope. Hope that the world he'd nearly died for might be ready to see him not as a threat, not as a stranger, but as a man. The camouflage jacket he wore wasn't a costume. It wasn't fashion. It was memory. It was armor. Every stitch held a story. The patch above his heart, the one that read Rawlins, had been sewn on by a medic after his first tour, when his uniform had been torn during an ambush. She had handed it back to him with a nod and said, "Stitched with your blood, Sergeant." So yes, when he walked into the farmer's market that morning, he walked like a man who had earned every second of peace. He walked with a limp that he didn't bother to hide, because pain wasn't shameful. It was proof. Proof he'd survived something. He came for tomatoes. That was all. He liked the way they tasted when they were fresh and warm from the sun. Not the kind from chain stores, wrapped in plastic and drowned in chemicals, but real ones, ugly, lopsided, vibrant like summer itself. The kind that reminded him of his mother's hands when she made stew in the fall, humming gospel in the kitchen and never using a recipe. Elijah believed in memory food. He didn't expect smiles. Didn't expect discounts. Didn't expect a handshake or a thank you for your service. All he wanted was a few good tomatoes and a walk under the sky without having to watch his back. But the world doesn't always know what to do with quiet men in camouflage. To them, he was too much story and not enough explanation. So they watched him, whispered, and then came Travis. The thing about people like Travis is, they never throw the first punch with their hands. They throw it with words. They wrap their prejudice in questions, in suggestions, in smiles that don't reach the eyes. You lost, buddy? No one ever asks that question when you look like you belong. But Elijah didn't flinch. He never did. Instead, he stood there, still as a gravestone, scanning the market like he was reading something no one else could see. And maybe he was. Maybe in that moment, he was standing in two places at once, Knoxville and Kandahar, America and its shadow. He heard the girl fall. He saw her mother's panic. And instinct took over. He moved because that's what soldiers do. They move toward the sound of distress. Even when it's not their fight. Even when they know what will come next. He didn't know his kindness would trigger suspicion. That his gentleness would be mistaken for threat. That the peppermint in his hand would make a mother recoil, and a town turn its gaze inward. But by the time he bent to unzip his bag, Elijah Rollins it wasn't just the peppermint that did it. It was the way Elijah handed it over, slowly, gently, palm open, head tilted with the slightest smile. The kind of gesture you'd expect from a grandfather offering candy at church. No sudden moves. No raised voice. Just kindness, wrapped in habit. The child, no more than 6, had tripped over a crate of pears beside her mother's stall. Tears welled up instantly, and the crowd parted with the usual awkward panic reserved for public mishaps. People either stared too hard or looked away too fast, embarrassed by the idea of someone else's pain. Elijah didn't hesitate. He stepped forward without ceremony, kneeling with the grace of a man who had once done this same movement in a war zone, under fire, with blood on his hands and prayers on his lips. The girl looked at him, and for a moment, she didn't cry. She blinked, studied him like children do, instinct first, fear second. He didn't wear fear. He wore steadiness. She saw that. That's when her mother screamed, "Get away from her!" It wasn't the words. It was the volume. The urgency. The accusation that crackled like gunfire through the quiet market air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone dropped a carton of eggs. A dog barked once and fell silent, ears pinned back. The woman rushed forward, snatching her daughter by the wrist and pulling her behind her like a purse in a dark alley. Her face was flushed, not with heat, but fear. No, worse than fear. It was panic tainted by something deeper. Disgust. "You don't touch my child," she spat. Elijah stood slowly. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Just upright, his hands still visible, his jacket shifting as he moved like the wings of a sleeping hawk. "I was just helping her up," he said. Without apology. But the mother had already decided what she saw. A black man, in army fatigues, touching her child. The details didn't matter anymore. The story had already written itself in her head. And that's when Travis decided to speak. He had been watching from his stall across the path, leaning against a stack of watermelon crates like a king in a throne he didn't deserve. Travis was the kind of man who looked like he'd always been told he was right. Tall, red-faced from either sun or beer, or both, and with a voice that had never once been trained to whisper. He pointed at Elijah like he was identifying a pest. "You people don't know how to act," Travis growled. "Every damn time. Always trying to be the hero, huh?" There was a ripple in the air. A shift. The kind you feel in your stomach before a storm breaks. Elijah didn't move. Travis stepped closer. He wasn't shouting yet, but his voice had that cracked, tightening edge. The kind that made the hair on your neck rise, because it was always the last sound before something shattered. "What are you even doing here?" he continued. "This ain't your place, man. Go back to wherever the hell you came from." There was. The crowd, which had begun to settle, froze again. Some mouths opened in disbelief. A few hands went to hearts. But no one said anything. Not yet. Travis smirked, encouraged by the silence. He stepped closer, tapping the air between them with one thick finger. "You hear me, boy?" he said, voice louder now. "I said go back to the damn jungle." The word jungle hit harder than any slap. Not because it was original, but because it wasn't. It was old, tired, loaded with every ounce of hate America had hidden under its tongue for generations. It echoed with chains, with whites-only signs, with red-lined maps and burned crosses. It came soaked in ignorance, but thrown like a weapon. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thunderous. Even Travis seemed to realize he'd said too much. He looked around, half expecting laughter, support, anything. But the people weren't laughing. They were watching Elijah. He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't clench his fists. He just looked at Travis like a man might look at a fly buzzing against the window, annoyed but not dangerous. Then Elijah did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't smug. It was quiet, tired. The smile of a man who had lived long enough to know that not every war is worth fighting with fists. He reached down and unzipped his old army duffel bag. The gesture made the crowd shift. Shoulders tensed. One vendor dropped her phone and didn't bother to pick it up. Travis took a step back. Just one. Barely noticeable. From the bag, Elijah pulled out a single item. A folded American flag. Neatly pressed. Edges crisp. Corners sharp. He unfolded it with care. With reverence. As if he were in a ceremony, not a confrontation. The kind of movement that made you feel like you should stand. Remove your hat. Lower your voice. He held it in both hands, the way you hold a memory that still hurts. This, he said, voice low but firm, was handed to me by a widow in Kandahar. After we lost her husband to an IED. He died holding the line. So did 4 others in my unit. He paused. The flag fluttered slightly in the summer breeze. They were black. But, one was Filipino. We bled the same. Travis said nothing. Elijah's eyes moved across the crowd. Not pleading. Not asking for understanding. Just offering truth. I fought for this flag, he continued. Carried men under it. Buried brothers beneath it. And I'd do it again. He turned back to Travis, gaze steady. You don't get to tell me where I belong. I've already earned my place. Then he folded the flag slowly, carefully, with muscle memory so precise it made time itself pause. No one spoke. Even the mother holding her daughter had let go of her arm. The market had split in two. There are silences that slip by unnoticed, like the hush before a song begins or the pause between words when 2 people speak over breakfast. Then there are silences that settle on your shoulders like a weight. Not soft, not gentle, but heavy and watchful, as if the world itself is deciding whether to speak or hold its breath forever. That was the kind of silence that filled the market after Elijah folded his flag. No one moved at first. Even the birds seemed to stop their usual flutter and chatter in the trees above, as if unsure whether they were allowed to sing again. The woman with the child didn't speak. She didn't even blink. Her daughter, still clutching the peppermint in her small hand, looked from Elijah to her mother, trying to understand what grown-ups so often failed to explain. Travis hadn't left. He stood with his mouth slightly open, like a man who had stepped off a cliff and hadn't realized he was falling yet. His hands were loose at his sides, but they weren't fists anymore. They were something else now, uncertain, almost trembling. You could see it, the unraveling. The slow realization that something sacred had just happened and that he'd stood on the wrong side of it. Not because someone told him. Not because the crowd booed or cursed him. But because for the first time, maybe in his whole life, he had been completely, utterly irrelevant. Elijah hadn't fought him. Hadn't shouted. Hadn't swung. And somehow, that made it worse. Because when a man like Travis expected a war and got a funeral instead, a funeral for his pride, for his prejudice, he didn't know what to do with the silence that followed. A teenager near the fruit cart finally moved. He bent to pick up the carton of broken eggs he'd dropped earlier. The movement cracked the stillness like a pebble tossed in a frozen lake. A few people followed, adjusting their stalls, turning back to their baskets, pretending to care about cucumbers again. But the energy had changed. The market, once a hum of harmless routine, now breathed slower, heavier. Not afraid. Not hostile. Just aware. as if everyone had just seen something they didn't want to forget, but didn't quite know how to carry. Elijah said nothing more. He returned the folded flag to his duffel bag, zipped it, and slung the strap over his shoulder with the ease of a man who'd done it 1,000 times before. Then, without ceremony, he walked away from the stall and toward the parking lot, his boots thudding softly against the dusty path. And still, no one stopped him. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to. It was the produce vendor, an older man named Mr. Darnell, who finally spoke. He had owned that market stall longer than some of the customers had been alive. His face was weathered like dried tobacco, and his voice came with the authority of someone who'd worked hard for every wrinkle on his hands. "You let him walk off like that?" he asked the crowd, not shouting, not accusing, just asking. No one answered. He leaned forward, palms pressed against the wooden frame of his stall. "That man bled for this country. And what did we give him? Suspicion? A damn slur? We ought to be ashamed." The words didn't cause a riot. They didn't spark applause. They just hung in the air like a lantern, faint but warm, showing the shape of things that had been hidden in shadow too long. Some nodded. Some couldn't meet his eyes. Travis still stood near the watermelon crates. He wasn't moving. He looked smaller now, like the heat had been turned down inside his chest, and all that was left was steam. He rubbed the back of his neck, looked toward the parking lot, and said under his breath, "I didn't mean..." But he didn't finish, because deep down he knew he had. And that was the part he couldn't fix with an apology. The mother of the little girl pulled her daughter close and whispered something in her ear. The child nodded slowly, then walked over to Mr. Darnell's stall, still clutching the peppermint, and placed it gently on the edge of the wooden table. "Tell him thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Then she turned and walked back. Darnell picked up the candy, turned it over in his hand like it was a relic, then slid it into his shirt pocket with care. Farther down the market, whispers had started. Not gossip, not rumors, but quiet reckonings. Some spoke about Elijah, how often he came to the market, always early, always polite, always alone. Others asked if anyone knew what unit he served with, or if he had family nearby. One woman said she remembered him reading at the library to school kids last year. Another recalled how he once fixed her flat tire outside the gas station without asking for a thing. Suddenly, people began remembering. And it wasn't the memory of his military service that struck them the hardest. It was how easy it had been to ignore it until now. Travis finally moved. He grabbed his folding chair and sank into it, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. No more bravado. No more smirks. Just a man who had mistaken someone's scars for a threat instead of a story. He didn't speak again for the rest of the morning. As the sun climbed higher and the scent of peaches and sweetbread returned to the breeze, life at the market resumed, but not the same way. When someone dropped their wallet, 3 people reached to help. When a child wandered too far from her mother, a stranger gently redirected her back. When an old man struggled with his bags, 2 teenagers walked them to his car without being asked. The silence had passed, but it had left something behind. A memory, a lesson, a mirror. Because what Elijah had done wasn't just about pride or dignity. It was about restraint. About refusing to become the thing your enemy wants you to be. About choosing honor when insulted, grace when attacked, and peace when war was easier. And maybe that was what hurt the most for men like Travis. Not that Elijah stood his ground, but that he did it with more strength in silence than Travis had ever found in noise. Elijah always packed the flag last. Tucked beneath an extra shirt, beside a battered photo album, and the bronze cross that hung from a shoelace he'd once worn around his neck in Kandahar. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't ceremony. It was memory, layered and folded, stitched into the shape of a quiet burden. He hadn't planned to take it with him that day. It was supposed to be a simple Saturday. A bag of peaches, maybe some cucumbers. But something in his chest, something he'd learned to listen to over the years, told him to carry it, just in case. And now, hours later, Elijah sat in the cab of his truck, hands resting on the steering wheel as if he were still waiting for permission to move. The flag sat beside him on the passenger seat, still folded, still tight, still sacred. It hadn't changed. But something in him had. He didn't start the engine. He just stared at the cloth. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because it symbolized something, though it did. But because that rectangle of stars and stripes held names. Names that no one in that market would ever speak. Names carved into stone thousands of miles away. Names he still heard when the night came quiet. Every time he folded it, he remembered them. Private Sam Devereaux, the kid from East Baltimore who used to beatbox in the barracks and write rap verses in the sand. Corporal Miguel Torres, who'd sent his entire paycheck home to his abuela and kept a Bible duct-taped to his chest like armor. Staff Sergeant Michael Green, his closest friend, who had bled out in Elijah's arms on a road outside Spin Boldak, whispering the name of a daughter he hadn't seen in 3 years. They were there, all of them, woven into the seams of that flag. And when Travis said, "Go back to the jungle," it wasn't just Elijah he insulted. He insulted them. He insulted the silence that fell over the camp each time a patrol didn't return. The letters that had to be written. The dog tags Elijah still kept in a cigar box under his bed. Travis had spoken like a man who thought patriotism was loud. Elijah knew better. Patriotism wasn't the anthem played before a football game. It was staying awake all night beside a wounded brother because he begged you not to let him die alone. It was standing between a frightened child and gunfire in a dusty village with no name. It was coming home with parts of your soul missing, and still saying, "Yes, sir," when your country looked the other way. The flag didn't make him a hero. What made him a hero was what it cost him to carry it. And still he carried it. He took a deep breath now, one hand tracing the edge of the fold. For a long time, he didn't cry. Elijah had stopped crying years ago, not because he didn't feel, but because the tears had run dry. Dried up in a place where the desert sun melted your humanity before your boots even hit the ground. But now, something stung behind his eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was release. A release he didn't expect to find in a market surrounded by strangers and peaches and insults. And yet, there it was. Because something had happened back there. He hadn't fought. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't given Travis the blood he was hoping to see. He had folded a flag and made the world listen. He could feel it shifting. Not just in the people around him, but in himself. Elijah reached for the glove compartment and pulled out a thin manila envelope. Inside it were the photos, faded Polaroids and sharp digital prints from across his years in uniform. Most people never saw them. Not because he hid them, but because no one ever asked. But now he looked. He thumbed through the images. A younger him, grinning beside a Humvee, face smudged with sweat and dust. Sam flipping off the camera, grinning, always grinning. Torres asleep with a comic book on his chest. Green holding up a handmade sign that said, "I'll be home for Christmas, unless I get promoted to angel." He chuckled softly at that last one, the sound catching in his throat like it had nowhere to go. They were gone. But they had walked with him into that market. And when he'd pulled the flag from the bag, they'd stood beside him again. For a moment, Elijah imagined what they might have said. "Damn Eli, you still fold it like you're in church," Sam would have said. "Don't let that man get in your head, hermano," Torres would have added. "He's already lost." Green would have said nothing. Just nodded. That slow, deep nod he used to do when something mattered too much for words. Elijah tucked the photos back into the envelope and returned it to the glove box. He stared ahead for a while, watching dust swirl in the afternoon sun. Cars moved in and out of the lot. Life resumed. But he knew something had cracked open today. Not broken, opened. He picked up the flag again, this time with the intention of placing it gently in the back seat. But before he let go, he noticed something stuck beneath it. A small white object. He pulled it out. It was the peppermint. The one the little girl had brought him. She must have placed it on the edge of the bag, or maybe slipped it into the fold when he wasn't looking. He held it in his palm, heart pausing just long enough to catch its meaning. To her, it was just candy. To him, it was confirmation. That someone had seen. Not just the insult. Not just the restraint. But the man behind the silence. Elijah closed his fingers around the peppermint and leaned back in his seat. The corners of his mouth lifted, just slightly, not a smile exactly, but something softer. something easier. Then he started the engine. As the truck rumbled to life, he glanced in the rearview mirror, not to see who was behind him, but to make sure he was really leaving the place as someone different. Because sometimes you go to a market for peaches and come home with peace. Not the kind that fixes the world, but the kind that lets you sleep again. The flag was gone. The man with the quiet strength had walked away, leaving only a ripple in the air, like the hush that follows thunder. But the market hadn't gone back to normal. Not really. The peaches still sat in their crates, ripe and glowing beneath the July sun. The tomatoes still glistened with morning dew. Kids still darted between legs with melting popsicles. And yet, something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was quieter now, like a congregation after a sermon that went deeper than anyone expected. The crowd that had witnessed it, that moment when Elijah unfolded the flag, had mostly returned to their shopping. But not without glancing over their shoulders. Not without whispering things they hadn't planned to say. Not without hearing, somewhere in their hearts, the echo of a question they couldn't quite form. Had they seen a man or a message? And what had they done in the moment that mattered? Mara, the woman who had pulled her daughter back with urgency and fear, stood still in front of a basket of cucumbers. Her hand hovered over the produce, but she wasn't really looking at them. Her eyes were fixed somewhere far off, on the spot where the old man had stood. She hadn't said anything when the insult was hurled. She had clutched her child, heart pounding, eyes wide. She had pulled back. She had stepped away. But she hadn't stepped in. And that realization sat in her stomach like something heavy, something unfinished. Her daughter, Lily, stood beside her, still holding the little brown paper bag Elijah had given her. The peppermint remained untouched inside. She didn't ask for another candy. She didn't whine to go home. She just stood there, fingers curled tightly around the bag. "Mom," she said after a long silence. "That man was really nice." Mara blinked. "Yes, baby. He was." Why did the other man yell at him? There was. The question Mara had feared would come, because she didn't have a neat answer. She knelt down beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people don't see others for who they really are. They look at someone's skin or their clothes, or how quiet they are, and they forget to look at their heart." Lily frowned. "But that's dumb." Mara gave a small laugh, full of both pain and pride. "Yeah, it is." Just a few feet away, Travis stood frozen in front of the table where he'd launched his cruelty. The baskets of produce before him were still neat. Nothing had moved. But inside, he felt disjointed, like the frame of a house after a storm tears through. He hadn't followed Elijah. Hadn't apologized. Hadn't said a word after that flag came out. But now, his mouth was dry. His hands were twitching. His chest burned, not with anger anymore, but with something far less familiar, shame. He tried to justify it in his head. Told himself the man had probably been dramatic on purpose. That this was a manipulation. A performance. But none of those thoughts stuck. They slipped off the truth like water on stone. The truth was he had been cruel. Unprovoked. Calculated. He'd looked into the eyes of a man who had served his country and had treated him like garbage. Not because of anything that man had done, but because of what he, Travis, had learned to see when he looked at black skin. It was hard to admit, but harder not to. He hadn't expected a flag. Hadn't expected silence. Hadn't expected dignity. And that was what unsettled him the most. Because he had gone looking for conflict. But instead, Elijah had held up a mirror. Travis saw something in that mirror now. And he didn't like what stared back. His wife, Janet, came over with a bag of apples in hand. "We ready?" Travis looked at her, then back toward the road where Elijah's truck had disappeared. He opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. "Yeah, we're ready." But he wasn't. Not really. Across the market, at the corner stall with the wildflowers and mason jar honey, a college-aged girl named Tessa watched it all unfold from behind a stack of sunflowers. She hadn't said a word when Travis shouted. She hadn't stepped forward when the flag appeared. But now, she pulled out her phone and stared at the photo she had secretly snapped, Elijah, in profile, the flag in his hands, the wind catching just one corner like a salute. She hadn't planned to take the picture. But something had compelled her. And now, staring at it, she knew it wasn't just a photo. It was proof that quiet could be louder than rage. That sometimes, dignity could split a moment in two. Tessa opened her Instagram app. She typed out a caption. Then deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, she settled on. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. She hit post. By nightfall, the image would be shared over 60,000 times. By the next morning, the mayor's office would call, asking if she knew who the man was. But in that moment, none of that mattered to her. What mattered was the feeling in her chest, the one that told her she'd seen something holy in the middle of ordinary life. Back at the peach stand, the vendor, Mr. Roland, a Vietnam vet himself, stood with his arms folded. He hadn't said anything when it all went down. But now, he reached beneath his table and pulled out a worn baseball cap. He dusted it off. The patch read, 1st Marine Division. He hadn't worn it in years. Not because he wasn't proud, but because pride had been twisted by people who used it to hurt. But now it meant something again. He placed the cap on his head. Not for himself. For Elijah. And for every man who had carried a flag others tried to burn with words. The market began to thin. Clouds rolled in from the west, casting long shadows over the stalls. But the light of what had happened lingered, quiet, invisible, burning behind every eye that had witnessed it. And in every mind, one question rose again like smoke from a fire not fully put out. Who am I, when the moment comes? Do I speak? Do I fold? Do I carry or cast the first stone? It was a question they hadn't asked before. But after Elijah, they would never stop asking it again. The sun was beginning to dip behind the Tennessee hills by the time Elijah pulled into his driveway. The tires crunched softly over gravel, and the engine hummed low as he turned the key and let silence return to the cabin he called home. It was a small place, nothing grand. A wraparound porch with 2 rocking chairs. One had a slight creak in its right leg, the other was untouched, almost like a tribute. A tangle of green ivy coiled around the wooden beams like it had known this place longer than any man. The American flag still hung from the front post, though Elijah noticed it needed a good cleaning. He sat for a long moment in the truck before opening the door. His hand lingered on the steering wheel. Not out of exhaustion, but because what he'd carried that morning hadn't left his shoulders yet. It wasn't the flag. It wasn't even the insult. It was the weight of history, of memory, of every time he'd walked into a room and felt the air shift, of every door that stayed shut, every silence that stung sharper than a bullet. And yet, somehow, what echoed loudest was that little girl's voice. Thank you for serving. Not the old man's spit of hatred, not the cowardice of the silent crowd, but her small, innocent, and sincere. The way her hand had gripped the peppermint like it was sacred. He finally got out. Each step toward the porch felt heavier than it should have. He knew what this was, the aftershock. The moment your body comes down from battle, even though the war happened with words, not weapons. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old books. A framed photo of his unit sat on the mantel, 12 men, dusty, tired, and grinning in the desert heat. 4 of them had never made it back. He touched the frame gently, a small salute of remembrance. Then he sat in the chair that creaked. Let the quiet settle around him. It was the kind of silence only a man who had lived long enough could appreciate. Not empty, just full of things too big for words. He didn't need to check his phone to know what had happened since he left the market. The calls would come. Maybe the news. Maybe people who wanted to say they were sorry, or say they were proud, or ask how they could help. But he hadn't done it for that. Not for viral moments. Not even for recognition. He had done it for his father, who had marched in Selma and still died in a hospital that spelled his name wrong. He had done it for the brothers he lost, both overseas and in the streets that pretended they were home. He had done it because some battles never end. But sometimes, one act of dignity becomes a sword sharper than any rage. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the peppermint tin. Gave it a soft shake. Still half full. He smiled faintly. That little girl, Lily, he thought her mother had called her. She'd looked at him not as a black man, or a soldier, or a stranger. Just as a man. And that had been enough. He rose from the chair, went into the kitchen and opened a drawer. Inside, a stack of letters he had meant to burn long ago. Hate mail from years past. Notes left on his car. One had only 2 words, "Go back." He pulled it out, held it in his hands for a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he fed it into the fireplace. Flames took it eagerly, as if hungry to rid the world of it. It crackled, disappeared. A new kind of silence filled the room. One not haunted, but healed. Outside, dusk had turned to velvet. Stars blinked into being. Somewhere, an owl called out into the woods. But Elijah wasn't thinking of the night. He was thinking of the ripple. He hadn't split that market in 2 to make noise. He had done it to make space. Space for the people who wanted to do better but didn't know how. Space for the silent to become brave. For the loud to become still. For a little girl to grow up remembering that strength doesn't always shout. It stands. It listens. It waits. And then it rises, when rising matters most. The photo of Elijah holding the flag made the rounds online. It sparked arguments, praise, think pieces, and tears. Some called him a hero. Some said nothing at all. But in Knoxville, something real happened. The farmers' market held a Veterans Appreciation Day 2 weeks later. Elijah never asked for it. He didn't even attend. But dozens of vets showed up, wearing their caps, standing tall, carrying folded flags of their own. At Travis's booth, a new sign had been placed at the front. Respect is not optional. He didn't make speeches. But he handed out peaches with a humility he hadn't known he was capable of. The girl who posted the photo, Tessa, started a scholarship fund in Elijah's name for minority veterans returning from service. As for Lily, she now carried the peppermint tin everywhere. And when asked why, she simply said, "Because kind people need to know they're seen." Maybe justice doesn't always look like handcuffs or headlines. Sometimes, it looks like a man who could have yelled, but didn't. A man who stood when others sat in silence. A man who carried a flag not as a weapon, but as a reminder of who we could be, if we chose better. Let this story remind us, silence is a choice. So is courage. We won't always be the one holding the flag, but we can be the one who stands beside it. In a world that still whispers hate too easily, be the voice that whispers love, even when your voice shakes. If you believe in stories that heal, stories that confront, stories that linger, hit that like button. Subscribe for more. Because we're not just telling stories here. We're standing for something.